It was the color that struck me first. Not the shape, not even the absurdity of its presence there, but the unapologetic orange of it. That single defiant brightness among the grey-brown stones of Radcliffe Square. A pumpkin, perfectly round, sitting like an insolent student at the steps of the camera. I remember thinking it must have been left after some college jest, one of those modern entertainments that try too hard to imitate the past, though it was too early in the term for mischief and too deliberate in its placing to be accidental. The morning had the faint, cold clarity particular to Oxford in late October. A light both crisp and exhausted, as though the sun had grown tired of academic perfection. I had no business being there. Not really. The night before, the Sheldonian had hosted a performance of the Creation, and I had lingered longer than most. I had drunk just enough wine to dull the edges of the trumpets, then walked out into the wet air, thinking that Haydn had understood something about order that the rest of us never could. Now, standing before the camera, I wondered what order there might be in a pumpkin abandoned among dreams of stone and intellect. Lewis would have dismissed it. Probably still does if he remembers the case at all. He was never sentimental about these things. But there was something too intentional about it, the way it sat exactly on the third step, not rolled or tumbled, but placed, as if someone had known that geometry, not gravity, rules the heart of Oxford. I bent down, brushed a film of drizzle from its surface, and saw that the stem had been neatly cut. There was no mud clinging to its base. It had not been dragged from a garden. It had been carried. Behind me, the bells of St. Mary's began to sound the quarter hour, an academic, orderly reminder that time in Oxford is as regulated as guilt. A student couple passed, laughing too loudly. One of them pointed and said something about Halloween. I almost smiled, but I was already thinking about other things, about the symmetry of the act, about why the human mind seeks patterns even in fruit. Later that day, the pumpkin appeared again, or rather, what was left of it. Hollowed cleanly, placed this time outside the Bodleians' west gate. The porter, a man named Dyson who had long ago forgotten the difference between curiosity and routine, had opened it when it began to smell faintly of vinegar. Inside, there was a slip of folded paper. He brought it to me because it was written in Latin and he'd heard somewhere that I liked that sort of thing. I still remember the words, though I read them only once before handing them to Lewis. Fructus vetiti vitis testis est. He had to look it up, of course. Ovid. The fruit bears witness to the forbidden vine. An odd message for a piece of produce. Lewis thought it some undergraduate prank, a remnant of a forgotten initiation. I said nothing. I was thinking of Ovid, of his exile, of how easily a joke can disguise confession. That afternoon I walked back through the square. The light had turned the color of pewter, and a thin mist was climbing from the cobblestones. The pumpkin was gone, but the damp circle where it had sat remained, darker than the rest of the step. A bruise on the stone. I looked up at the camera's curve against the greying sky and felt, for no good reason, a kind of sorrow. Oxford has that effect. Beauty mistaken for benevolence. In the evening, I read the note again beneath the yellow lamp of my study. There was something peculiar about the handwriting. Not the Latin, but the hand itself. Feminine, perhaps, though firm. Each letter tilted slightly forward, as if in anticipation of something unfinished. On the back of the paper, barely visible, was a faint impression, the ghost of another sentence that had been written and torn away. I tilted it towards the light and could just make out the words, "I did not mean," before the ink vanished into nothing. I phoned the Bodleians' night desk and asked whether anyone had reported a missing item from special collections. They hadn't, but the clerk, a timid fellow who stammered through his vowels, mentioned that Dr. Eliza Hartwell had not been in that day. She had a carrel near the old Latin manuscripts, he said, and was usually there by 8. I knew her slightly. Tall, keen-eyed, with a sort of intelligence that makes conversation feel like confession. She lectured at St. Clement's and had once, over sherry, corrected me on a point of Roman prosody. When I hung up, I found myself staring again at the note. The letters seemed to lean closer together in the lamplight, conspiratorial. The room was silent except for the slow tick of the clock. I reached for the crossword folded on my desk, the day's Times, half finished as usual, and glanced at a clue I had ignored earlier. Fruit that conceals the seed of sin. I smiled then, though the smile felt borrowed, and wrote in the margin, pumpkin. Even now, I can hear the rain beginning against the window. The first of many nights that autumn when the city seemed to whisper something half-remembered and half-afraid. Perhaps that was when the case truly began. Not with a body, but with an object too bright for its surroundings and a sentence too ancient for its meaning. I've often thought that letters are more revealing when left unsent. The one I found folded inside the hollowed pumpkin was not a letter, but it carried the same unfinished weight, as though the writer had paused mid-thought, uncertain whether to confess or to conceal. The Latin line, when translated, offered little comfort. The fruit bears witness to the forbidden vine. There was something accusatory in it, something that seemed to turn inward, like remorse disguised as scholarship. Lewis, practical as ever, thought I was being fanciful. He said the handwriting looked posh but nervous, and suggested we ask the classics department to confirm whether it belonged to anyone who liked playing tricks on librarians. He has a way of reducing poetry to paperwork that I sometimes envy. Still, I asked him to take the note to the lab for prints, though I knew the paper was too smooth, too dry for such luck. Later in my office, I sat with the note under the desk lamp, watching the ink turn metallic in the light. I've always believed that certain words carry temperature, and these felt cold. At the bottom of the page, there was a faint indentation, as if the writer had pressed another sheet over it and written something above. I shaded the surface gently with the edge of a pencil until the ghost of a word began to appear. Eliza. The name meant nothing to Lewis. It meant a great deal to me. Dr. Eliza Hartwell, lecturer in classics, sharp-tongued, clever, the kind of woman who could quote Virgil in defense of a traffic fine. I'd met her once, perhaps twice, in the polite chaos of an academic dinner, where the wine is always better than the conversation. I remember her remarking that Oxford had two kinds of ghosts, the kind that haunt its buildings and the kind that publish papers about them. I remember thinking how right she was. When I phoned St. Clement's College, the porter told me she hadn't been seen since the weekend. I could hear him shuffling through the sign-in book, the slow scrape of pen against paper. No bicycle collected, no message left, only her name in neat script, crossed through by a trembling hand. He said she'd been expected to attend a meeting on Monday and hadn't arrived. There was a pause, then the sound of rain against glass. He added, almost as an afterthought, that her rooms were locked up tight. Lewis suggested we wait until morning. He said people disappear from Oxford all the time, to conferences, to lovers, to disappointment. I told him disappointment rarely required locked doors. He sighed, muttered something about my bloody intuition, and drove me home. We said little on the way, though I caught him glancing at the folded paper in my hand more than once, as if it might stain the upholstery. That night I dreamed of the Radcliffe Camera again. The square was empty, but for the sound of footsteps circling the stones. The pumpkin glowed faintly as if lit from within, and when I reached it, I saw the same folded note resting on top. Only this time, the handwriting was mine. I woke before dawn, made coffee that tasted of metal, and spread the papers on the table once more. There was something about the Latin that continued to bother me. Fructus vetiti vitis testis est. The grammar was flawless, but the construction was unusual. The phrase vitis testis could mean not only vine witness, but living witness. A subtle difference, but then, truth often hides in syntax. By mid-morning, the call came. A constable cycling along the canal path had found a bicycle lying half-submerged near Folly Bridge. The basket still held a book, Ovid's Metamorphoses. Inside the cover, a nameplate, Dr. Eliza Hartwell, St. Clement's College. Lewis looked at me with the tired patience of a man who already suspects the answer. I said nothing. I was thinking of the line from Ovid again, the one about transformation through loss. Oxford has a habit of turning the living into legend, and somewhere in the quiet between the bells I knew that the note had not been meant as a riddle at all. It had been a farewell. There are courtyards in Oxford that seem to breathe. St. Clement's was one of them. The place looked perpetually half asleep, as if time itself had taken up residence in the ivy. Rain had polished the cobbles to the color of old coins, and the air smelled faintly of wet stone and tobacco smoke. I remember thinking it was the sort of setting that demanded discretion, the kind of college where silence had long ago been institutionalized. Lewis disliked these visits. He always said the dons made him feel like an intruder at a funeral. I told him that in Oxford, every conversation was a funeral for the truth. He didn't laugh. We passed beneath the archway and climbed the worn stairs to the senior common room, where a small fire burned with reluctant civility. Dean Crispin Vale received us as though we were there to inspect the plumbing. He had the smooth, lacquered voice of a man accustomed to agreement. Behind him hung a portrait of the college's founder, one of those grim-jawed Puritans whose eyes followed you from era to era. Vale spoke of Dr. Hartwell with the measured sorrow of institutional grief. A fine mind, he said, though inclined toward theatricality. He believed she had gone abroad. I asked when exactly she had decided that. He hesitated, just long enough for the silence to bruise the air. The bursar, Margaret Dean, entered then, pale, composed, smelling faintly of lavender and sherry. She corrected Vale softly. Eliza had not taken her passport. I noted how Vale's jaw tightened. Between them hung the brittle courtesy of colleagues who know too much about one another. She poured tea as if performing penance. There was a tremor in her hand, barely perceptible, but the sort that speaks louder than words. When she set the cup before me, a drop of milk trembled on the saucer like a held breath. Dr. Thomas Cleeve arrived last, handsome in the careless way of men who are accustomed to admiration and undeserving of it. He offered sympathy with that dangerous ease that passes for sincerity. Eliza had been fragile, he said, preoccupied. He added almost wistfully that she had a gift for turning footnotes into revelations. I asked when he had last seen her. He glanced toward the fire, then said, Saturday evening, after dinner in Hall. He had walked her across the quad. She had spoken of Ovid, of metamorphosis and consequence. Then, as we reached her staircase, she said something odd, something about fruit and sin. I felt the muscles in my neck tighten. Lewis shifted beside me, perhaps sensing the connection, but I said nothing. Sometimes a silence reveals more than any question. When we left, the rain had begun again. Fine, persistent, almost apologetic. The chapel bell tolled somewhere beyond the cloisters. I paused beneath the archway, looking back at the dimly lit windows. A shadow passed across one. Cleave's, perhaps, or the reflection of a branch. Oxford delights in ambiguity. Back in my office, I spread my notes on the desk. 3 colleagues. The dean who mourned too carefully, the bursar who trembled, the lecturer who misquoted poets. Misquotation had always intrigued me. People reveal themselves most when they believe they are being clever. Cleeve had spoken of Ovid's line, fruit and sin, but in Metamorphoses the phrase never appears. The nearest reference lies in Ars Amatoria, where Ovid warns that desire often disguises itself as virtue. A small error, perhaps, but I have learned to distrust small errors. I phoned Lewis and asked him to check the senior common room logbook. He grumbled, but by evening he had found what I expected. Hartwell's name, signed out on Saturday night, not in her own hand, but in ink darker than the rest. Someone had traced it, copying carefully. I poured a whiskey and watched the amber light catch the rim of the glass. Forgery, however minor, is always an act of affection or fear. The question was, which? As the night deepened, I thought again of the pumpkin, of its deliberate symmetry. St. Clement's was a place that worshipped symmetry, the pairing of intellect and concealment, tradition and deceit. Somewhere within its walls, I was certain, someone had tried to preserve both order and sin in the same breath. I looked out through the rain at the spires, dissolving into mist, and felt that peculiar mixture of exhilaration and dread that marks the beginning of every real case. The college slept behind its locked doors, but the city, as ever, was awake with secrets. And I, fool that I am, was already listening for their whisper. There are few things more intimate than another person's handwriting. Not their speech, nor their scent, nor the way they laugh when caught off guard. Those things belong to the living, but handwriting, once its owner has gone, feels like breath left on paper. It trembles with a kind of unfinished life. Hartwell's rooms at St. Clement's had the stillness peculiar to absence. Books stood in tight, disciplined ranks, a vase of dead tulips bent like penitents beside the window. Dust had begun to settle on her desk, though the faint ring of a recently lifted cup marked where she had last sat. I told Lewis to wait outside. There are rooms one enters alone, out of respect or superstition. The drawers yielded little of use. Receipts, lecture notes, the sad bureaucracy of scholarship. But beneath a stack of correspondence bound with faded ribbon lay 3 letters, each begun and never finished. The first addressed simply to T, written in quick, impatient strokes. I cannot forgive you, not for the lie, but for how easily you told it. The second to M, gentler, apologetic, ending abruptly mid-sentence. The third bore no initial, only the word beloved before dissolving into hesitation. It was as if she had written to the same person under 3 disguises, testing which truth she could bear to send. The sight of them stirred something uncomfortably familiar. Loneliness leaves a recognizable pattern. The impulse to speak and withdraw in the same breath. I placed the letters side by side and noticed that one sheet, the unfinished apology, carried a faint indentation of another line, pressed through from a missing page. Under the light I could just make it out. Meet me at Stanton Edge. The name tugged at a memory. An old coaching inn halfway to the Downs, a place once favored by poets who needed seclusion or debtors seeking delay. Lewis came in then, damp from the rain, holding a photograph he had found behind the bookshelf. 4 people, younger by decades, standing on the steps of the Bodleian, Hartwell, Vale, Dean, and Cleeve. They smiled as if captured in mutual admiration, yet her expression seemed detached, her eyes directed not at the camera, but at someone out of frame. At the bottom corner, written in the pencil, was a date, 1992, and, in smaller script, St. Clement's Summer Lecture. A trivial note, except the college records had claimed she joined in 1993. A year's difference, one might think, hardly worth attention. But in Oxford, years are like rooms. What happens in one seldom remains confined there. I sat in her chair, the letters spread before me, and felt that quiet vertigo that comes when clues begin to arrange themselves, not by logic, but by emotion. Each letter seemed a fragment of dialogue she had never been permitted to finish. It was not the content that mattered, but the rhythm. Accusation, retreat, Confession. A conversation with a man she could neither expose nor forget. Lewis asked if we should inform the dean. I told him not yet. I wanted to see the handwriting again, unguarded in its natural setting. That meant the college archives, the register of fellowship renewals, signatures written under fluorescent light when no one bothers to disguise their character. That evening, I compared them at my desk. The hand that had signed Eliza Hartwell on her appointment form was the same as the hand that had written the letter to T. The same deliberate lean, the same impatience of pressure at the tail of each word. But the note found in the pumpkin, though similar, lacked that impatience. The strokes were slower, almost reverent. I thought of Vale's careful manner, of his fondness for appearances. Scholars often imitate style better than substance. Outside, the city exhaled rain against the windows. I poured a small whiskey and watched the ink dry on the photograph's edge where a drop had fallen. The faces blurred slightly, as if history were already erasing itself. I wondered what kind of lie would require 3 letters to tell and none to send. When I left, I turned off the lamp but paused at the door. The faint outline of the letters still glimmered on the desk in the dying light. Words meant to travel, stilled forever. Oxford has a way of preserving silence as others preserve relics. Later, lying awake, I thought again of that line from Ovid, the one that had started all this. The fruit bears witness to the forbidden vine. Perhaps the letters were not accusations or apologies at all. Perhaps they were simply witness to love misused or truth delayed too long to matter. There is a particular loneliness in places that were once cheerful. The inn at Stanton Edge had that quality, the faded cheer of a place that had outlived its own welcome. It stood on a bend in the old coach road, half swallowed by fog, its sign creaking faintly like something remembering laughter. Lewis thought it a wild goose chase, and perhaps it was. But the words pressed faintly into Eliza Hartwell's unfinished letter had named this place, and I have never been able to ignore a ghost that insists on an address. Inside, the smell was of damp wood and smoke that never entirely left. The landlord, a thin man with the slow gaze of one accustomed to emptiness, looked up from polishing a glass and said they hadn't had guests for a fortnight. I asked if he recognized the photograph. Eliza among her colleagues, smiling at something beyond the frame. He studied it longer than politeness required. Then he said softly that a woman like that had come 2 weeks before, booked a single room, paid in cash, stayed 1 night only. She'd asked about the old vaults beneath the inn, the ones sealed up after the war. Lewis raised an eyebrow at me, the sort of look that says he's waiting for the logic to appear. I asked if she'd mentioned why. The landlord shrugged, said she'd been looking for a passage, whatever that meant. Oxford people, he added, always chasing tunnels to nowhere. We took the narrow stairs up to the room she'd rented, small, sparse, faintly touched by perfume and mildew. The bed was neatly made. I've learned that beds tell their own stories. This one said she'd lain awake. The coverlet was turned back, the pillow still faintly indented. On the windowsill, someone had traced a circle in the dust. Absent-mindedly, repeatedly, as though the hand had been thinking faster than the mind. I felt the faintest thrill of recognition. The same gesture appeared in the corner of one of her lecture notes I had seen earlier, a series of circles drawn into the margin beside a line of Latin, in arcana silentium, into the secret silence. Lewis found an old guest book behind the counter downstairs, its leather warped by years of handling. He turned the pages with the exaggerated care of a man trying not to smudge something that might matter. Hartwell's name wasn't there, but a torn page had been tucked into the spine, part of an older register, dated 1958. Only one entry remained legible, CV-MD-TC-EH. I didn't need to ask whose initials those were. I remember standing in that dim room with the low ceiling and thinking that time in Oxford folds back on itself like a manuscript reused by a desperate scribe. Perhaps Hartwell hadn't been looking for a passage through the inn. Perhaps she'd been tracing her way through memory, following something left unfinished by the same names that now appeared in every corner of the case. Outside, the rain had thinned to a mist. A fox darted across the road, its shape dissolving into the hedgerows as if the world were reluctant to hold it. The landlord offered tea that tasted faintly of rust. He told us a story, local lore, about a room under the foundations, once used for keeping wine but later sealed after a flood. The villagers called it the scholar's cellar. They said students used to come up from Oxford to perform some kind of ritual there, pumpkins, candles, and Latin prayers. He laughed, embarrassed, said it was probably nonsense. But he added that sometimes, in heavy rain, one could hear water trickling below the floorboards, as though something underneath still breathed. When we left, Lewis muttered that I was chasing superstition. I told him superstition and scholarship were closer relatives than people think. Both begin with a question no one can quite answer. Driving back toward the city, I kept seeing that circle in the dust, the way her hand must have moved. Clockwise, slow, precise. I remembered her marginal note and the line that had followed it in Ovid. And in the silence, truth waits. There was something both comforting and cruel in that idea. Truth does wait, but it is rarely patient and never merciful. By the time we reached Oxford, the lamps along the High were winking through fog. I imagined her standing in that inn room, tracing her circles, listening to the trickle beneath the floorboards, searching, as all of us do in our own ways, for the entrance to something long buried. I have always distrusted ceremonies of remembrance. They are never for the dead, but for those who wish to tidy grief into something public and manageable. St. Clement's, that afternoon, was festooned with lilies and insincerity. The memorial lecture for Dr. Eliza Hartwell was well attended, the kind of attendance that owes more to curiosity than affection. Vale stood at the lectern, immaculate in gown and gravity, speaking of brilliance and loss as if the two were interchangeable. Lewis fidgeted beside me. He whispered that these people were performing, and I told him softly that performance was Oxford's first language. The hall smelled faintly of polish and paper decay. I watched Cleves seated near the front, his profile lit by the lectern lamp. He was listening too carefully. Every phrase Vale uttered seemed to echo somewhere inside him. When he rose to give his own tribute, his voice carried a warmth that did not belong to grief. He quoted Horace, or believed he did, "Dulce et decorum est pro veritate mori." I felt a small flicker in my chest. Horace had never written that. When applause followed, I could hear the polite rustle of collective relief. I did not join them. I was thinking of Cleves' mistake, not an accident of memory, but a deliberate inversion. To die for truth, not for one's country. I scribbled it in the margin of my notes. Misquote Nachas' message? After the lecture there was wine, of course. The clinking of glasses always sounds louder when no one wishes to speak of what matters. Dean Margaret. Dean hovered near the window, her expression too composed. She avoided my gaze until I approached her. She said she had arranged the event herself, though she hadn't wanted to. There had been pressure from the college. I asked whether Vale had encouraged her. She said, very quietly, that Vale encouraged everything that made him appear compassionate. Then, glancing at my notebook, she added that Eliza had once accused Vale of theft, intellectual, not material. He had dismissed it as hysteria. Lewis drifted toward the buffet, leaving me with the uneasy stillness of the room. The rain had begun again, thin lines against the glass. Cleve appeared at my shoulder, smelling faintly of cologne and red wine. He asked if I thought Eliza's work would survive her. I said that depends on how you define survival. He smiled, not kindly. and said truth outlives everyone, even its enemies. I asked whether that included him. He did not answer. Later, as the crowd thinned, a student stumbled in from the quadrangle, his face pale beneath the drizzle. He was holding a pumpkin, or what was left of one, split open like a wound, its surface streaked with something dark. The porter behind him said the boy had found it by the Radcliffe gate. The smell reached us before the truth did. Blood, faint but unmistakable. Lewis took the pumpkin from the student and laid it on a tablecloth, as if afraid it might bruise. The liquid had begun to congeal, sticky and dull. Not animal, not theatrical. Human. Cleve leaned over it, muttering that it must be another prank. I saw his fingers tremble. Vale arrived moments later, his expression perfectly neutral, his gaze passing from me to the bloodied rind without surprise. He asked whether we intended to involve the police, forgetting, perhaps, that I already was the police. I told him we would. He smiled thinly and said, "Oxford prefers discretion." That night I walked alone through the empty quad. The memorial candles still flickered in the windows, small defenses against the encroaching dark. The rain had washed the last of the autumn leaves into the drains, leaving only the faint scent of earth and smoke. I thought of Eliza's line about fruit and sin, of pumpkins and vines and the human hunger to make symbols out of everything. A false harvest, perhaps. Abundance masking decay. When I reached my car, Lewis was waiting. He said the lab would confirm the blood by morning. I told him I already knew whose it was. He looked at me sharply, but I said nothing more. Some truths are best spoken only once, and only to the dead. The night had the kind of stillness that makes you aware of your own breathing. Oxford in November is like that. The city exhales slowly, the river fog drifts up through the lanes, and even the stones seem to hesitate before echoing your footsteps. I'd walked these streets for years, yet that evening they felt newly suspicious, as if each shadow held a word I'd once known and forgotten. Lewis had spent the afternoon digging through college archives, while I sat in the Bodleian, half reading Ovid and half listening to the ghosts of Latin masters long gone. There's a peculiar solace in ancient languages. They disguise the unbearable with elegance. Fructus vetitivitis, testis est. The fruit bears witness to the forbidden vine. The line had ceased to be a riddle. It had become a confession. But whose? The librarian had handed me a file no one had requested in decades, a set of minutes from the St. Clement's Literary Society dated 1957. The handwriting was small, precise, and trembling with self-importance. Buried among the notes about readings and wine allowances was a reference to the Vine Circle. I'd seen that name before. A faint carving in the undercroft of the Radcliffe Camera, barely visible beneath the soot. A secret society of sorts, composed of students who believed Latin could disguise anything, even sin. 4 names appeared on the list of founding members: Crispin Vale, Margaret Dean, Thomas Cleve, and an E.H. Lewis looked over my shoulder and muttered that it couldn't be the same E.H., not unless Hartwell had discovered the secret to time travel. I told him Oxford had always been good at bending time. The initials might belong to someone else, but patterns rarely repeat without reason. We went together to the Radcliffe Undercroft, though he hated the idea. The custodian, after some persuasion, unlocked the iron gate with the weary compliance of a man used to professors' odd requests. The air was damp and heavy with old dust. The walls were carved with Latin graffiti, invocations, declensions, fragments of verse. Students' bravado fossilized in language. Near the northern wall, behind a collapsed lectern, I found what I was looking for, a faint inscription, half buried in mildew. Vitis vetita vivit in cord. The forbidden vine lives in the heart. The words struck like a memory you didn't know you owned. Not because of what they said, but because of what they omitted. There was no ending to the sentence, no signature, no date. Someone had intended to finish it but hadn't. I traced the final letter with my finger. The stone beneath felt smooth, recent. Someone had been here within the last few weeks. Lewis found a small brass token wedged between the stones, a college crest worn flat by handling. He wanted to bag it as evidence. I told him to wait. The pattern on the edge wasn't a crest at all, but a cipher. 4 interlocking vines forming the letter E. I slipped it into my pocket. That night, back in my flat, I poured a glass of whiskey and studied the token under lamplight. The design reminded me of something I'd seen in the Bodleian Register, the book plate from one of Hartwell's private editions of Ovid. She had used the same emblem, embossed faintly inside the cover. It wasn't vanity. It was belonging. The forbidden vine lived in her heart because she had inherited it. It was nearly midnight when Lewis phoned. His voice sounded uneasy, like a man who'd found something he wished he hadn't. He'd cross-checked the initials from the Society's founding record with the matriculation lists. There had indeed been another E.H., Edward Hartwell, Fellow in Classics, dismissed from the college in 1958 for conduct unbecoming. He'd vanished after that, his name quietly excised from the college archives. I asked Lewis to check the family register. There was silence on the line, and then, "Brother." The whiskey turned bitter in my mouth. So that was it. The circle was not metaphorical. It was blood. The fruit had indeed borne witness, not to sin, but to inheritance. I closed my eyes and listened to the city breathing through the rain. Somewhere in the distance, a bell marked the hour. I thought of the Latin words carved into the stone, vitis vetita vivit in cord, and realized they weren't a warning at all. They were an admission. The past, like Latin, never dies. It merely waits for translation. Silence, when you've spent a life listening for lies, is the most eloquent sound of all. Margaret Dean's silence was of that kind, the sort that refuses explanation because explanation would be redundant. I found her at home that evening, alone in a flat overlooking the canal. The curtains were drawn but not fully closed, leaving a slim aperture through which the last of the daylight had slipped, dissolving into that peculiar Oxford twilight, the color of diluted ink. She opened the door without surprise, as if I had been expected long before I knew to come. Her expression was one of resignation, not fear. The table behind her was laid for one, though the meal had gone cold. A gramophone idled in the corner, turning the last groove of a record too softly to hear. There was a smell of wine and old paper, that particular perfume of loneliness preserved by routine. Lewis had offered to accompany me, but I declined. There are confessions that require solitude. She gestured to a chair, and I sat, feeling the faint warmth still lingering in the fabric. She poured me a glass of red without asking, and another for herself, then said she had been wondering how long it would take me to come. I told her it had taken longer than it should. She looked at the wine before speaking. "Eliza was brilliant," she said, "but brilliance can be cruel." She wanted to expose something that should have stayed buried. I asked what that something was. She didn't answer immediately. She turned toward the window, watching the faint lights flicker across the canal. When she finally spoke, her voice had the fragile cadence of someone remembering a hymn learned in childhood. "Vale's thesis," she said, "the one that made his reputation. It wasn't his." Eliza had found the original paper in the archives, unsigned but unmistakably his handwriting, dated years before he claimed to have written it. He had stolen from a friend, her brother. I must have looked puzzled, for she gave a small, humorless smile. "Edward Hartwell," she said quietly. "The brother who disappeared in 1958, the man whose name no one in St. Clement's now speaks." The words fell with the gravity of a long-sealed confession. I thought again of the carved initials in the Radcliffe undercroft, of the vine that lived in the heart, the past written in Latin, rewritten in shame. Eliza had unearthed not merely a fraud, but a burial. I asked whether she had told anyone. She shook her head. She said the college had already been built upon so many lies that one more truth would only unbalance the foundations. She admitted that Vale had known of Eliza's discovery. They had met privately, she said, though she hadn't meant to betray that detail. I saw the flicker of regret cross her face. She covered it by taking another sip of wine. "You destroyed one of her letters, didn't you?" I said it gently, almost kindly. Her fingers tightened around the glass, and she didn't deny it. She said she had done so out of fear, not loyalty. Fear of what exposure would do to the college, to Vale, to her. Fear of being the last witness to an era everyone else preferred to forget. Outside, a barge drifted past, its engine thudding softly through the floorboards. The record on the gramophone clicked to an end. Neither of us moved to stop it. I asked if she had loved Vale. Her shoulders sank, as though the question had been waiting in the air all along. "Once," she said, "a long time ago, when intellect still masqueraded as virtue, he made promises in Latin, words that sounded eternal until you translated them." I told her that Latin had always been the language of evasion. She smiled faintly, perhaps in agreement. When I rose to leave, she said, almost as an afterthought, that Eliza had come to her on the night she vanished. They had argued. Eliza had accused her of cowardice. Then, softer, she added, she was right. At the door, I turned back. I asked what had become of the letter, the one she had destroyed. She hesitated, then said she hadn't burned it completely. A single line had survived, clinging to the ashtray like a warning. There is more life in death than in deceit. I thanked her and stepped into the night. The canal reflected the lamps in trembling gold, and I could hear the faint echo of the record spinning still, a needle tracing silence into sound. Somewhere in the distance, a bell struck 10, the hour of truth, or its refusal. And as I walked away, I thought of Margaret Dean's silence, how it spoke louder than any confession. In Oxford, guilt is seldom shouted. It lingers quietly, like the echo of a language no one dares to translate. It is often the smallest of details that unravels the entire pattern. I've learned to watch for them, like the way a single note can betray a symphony's secret key. That evening, back in my flat, I returned to the pumpkin, the blood-streaked remnant we had recovered from Radcliffe Square. It had been carefully bagged, sealed by Lewis, and yet the faintest scent remained. Not of decay, not of the weather, but of wine. Ordinary wine would have gone unnoticed. I leaned closer, inhaling softly. Chateau Margaux, 1959. A gift not cheap, and one that had been in Vale's personal collection for years. The realization came gradually, the sort of slow burn that always precedes certainty. Someone had planned the scene meticulously. The wine had been poured, the pumpkin positioned, and the note hidden, all to suggest a theatrical death, a warning perhaps, or a misdirection. But the wine revealed the truth. Only Vale had access to that bottle. I considered the letters Hartwell had left unsent. Their emotional cadence had been genuine, the margins marked with impatience and regret. But this was an entirely different hand. Deliberate, controlled, almost reverential. The forger had known what Hartwell would have done, mimicking her script but unable to reproduce the tremor at the end of the line. A detail too small for most, yet to me it was the hinge upon which the case would turn. Lewis entered with the lab report, muttering under his breath about Oxford being a city of ghosts and accountants. The blood matched Hartwell's DNA, confirming what I had already suspected. The pumpkin, the wine, the notes. All signs pointing to someone intent on creating confusion, obscuring motive beneath layers of ritual and poetry. I told him to check the inventory of Vale's collection, noting particularly any bottles missing from that vintage year. I sat with the letters spread before me once more. The final drafts, the inscriptions, the tiny smudges, all indicated someone who had studied Hartwell closely. Someone who understood her methods, her quirks, even her obsessive precision. The misquotation at the memorial lecture, the careful placement of initials in the Radcliffe undercroft, the choice of the pumpkin. Each element seemed independent until viewed together. Then they aligned, revealing a choreography I had not fully seen before. There was a subtle echo in the crossword I had left open on my desk. Across 11 letters, clue. Fruit that conceals decay within, pomegranate. Odd, but the phrasing suggested concealment, not revelation. I wrote it in the margin, concealment rather than display, a detail that mirrored the crime itself, outwardly theatrical, inwardly fatal. Later, as the rain slid in thin curtains down the windows, I returned to the photograph of Hartwell and her colleagues. I had overlooked the way Vale's hand rested on the lectern, tight, controlling, the fingers curled almost imperceptibly around the edge. It was a posture he maintained whenever authority or guilt needed masking. The same posture had appeared in the memorial lecture photograph, during the toast when the wine was poured. A detail forgotten at the time, now glaring. I poured a small whiskey and stared at the amber liquid, watching light fracture in the glass. The city outside hummed with quiet indifference. Radcliffe Square, empty now, held its stones in the wet night, silent witnesses to the act. A pumpkin had borne witness, a note had whispered, and a bottle of wine had confessed. I made notes, slowly, deliberately, aware that the detail reconsidered, the wine, the posture, the smudge, might be the only thread leading to the final unraveling. Oxford, I reminded myself, rewards patience. And tonight, patience had finally begun to speak. The crypt beneath the Radcliffe Camera is a place one enters reluctantly, aware that every echo might be history or deceit. I had walked its steps before, tracing the fingers of the past in the chill stone, and yet that evening it felt alive, charged with the tension of secrets long buried. Lewis followed behind, his flashlight cutting a thin cone of light across damp walls, but he deferred to me. He knew I preferred silence to chatter in places such as this. I had summoned Vale under a pretense of necessity, the guise of collegial inquiry, though I suspected he already understood the danger of being alone with me in that shadowed vault. He arrived briskly, impeccably dressed, his gait betraying only the faintest awareness of unease. The stone floor echoed his steps, and the faint smell of earth and mildew mingled with the faint aroma of old wine. The memory of the bottle poured into the false harvest. I asked him to observe the inscriptions on the walls, the faint initials and Latin phrases that had long gone unnoticed by all but the most meticulous eye. He ran a gloved hand over the carved letters, and I noted the slight hesitation, the way his fingers paused over one particular vine-shaped initial. That moment alone told me more than his speech ever could. Recognition and the subtle weight of guilt. Then I confronted him with the sequence, the pumpkin, the letters, the misquoted memorial, the token found in the undercroft. His eyes flickered to mine, calculating, and I waited. Vale is always precise, even in misdirection. The truth is a thing of rhythm, and rhythm rarely deceives. He tried to deflect, of course, recounting the evening of Hartwell's disappearance in the familiar cadence of a scholar reciting memorized text. I allowed him to speak, listening for inflections, the tiny slip where knowledge collides with fear. And there it was, the subtle misplacement of a preposition, a hesitation when he mentioned the wine. I leaned closer and said softly that the wine had been his. Vale's composure faltered, just enough to admit, not to confess, but to expose the tremor beneath control. The memory of Hartwell, of her letters, of the careful imitation of her handwriting in the note, pressed down upon him. I watched as realization passed through him that all theatrical misdirection cannot withstand scrutiny, that symbols of guilt, no matter how cleverly staged, betray the author. He spoke finally, a murmur almost swallowed by the vaulted ceiling, that Dean had acted alone, that she had planted the pumpkin and orchestrated the scene to implicate him. The words were precise, calculated, but the emphasis, the way he repeated her initials and the gesture toward the letters, revealed what he feared most: exposure of complicity, however indirect. I repeated the Latin lines aloud, slowly, deliberately. Fructus vetiti vitis, testis est. Vitis vetita, vivit in cord. He flinched at the second phrase. Only someone who knew the note, the undercroft, and Hartwell's emblem could react that way. It was the final key, the small detail previously dismissed, now glowing with significance. At that moment, the Dean entered the crypt, her expression measured, as if she had rehearsed the confrontation in every possible permutation. Her hands trembled slightly, betraying a hesitation she hoped none would see. I recited the lines again, emphasizing the connection between the note and the carved cipher. Her eyes widened, and I saw the confession arrive before words were spoken. The deliberate placement of the pumpkin, the falsified letter, the orchestration of misdirection, all hers. Lewis moved closer, though he understood we were no longer acting. The reveal had occurred in gestures, in the tension of fingers and glances. The Dean's shoulders sagged, and she whispered, barely audible, that she had wanted only to protect the college and herself, that Hartwell had threatened too much, and that she had acted out of fear and jealousy. I watched her collapse into the shadows, the sound of stone absorbing the weight of her confession. The air in the crypt seemed to hold its breath, and I realized that in Oxford, confessions are often quiet, almost imperceptible, carried in gestures rather than in shouts. Outside, the bells of St. Mary's tolled in the night, and I walked back into the misted square, the memory of the confession echoing behind me. Some truths require silence, others a witness willing to listen, and tonight the crypt had borne both. Oxford in early December has a peculiar hush, as if the city itself anticipates confession. The spires are muted beneath a mist that softens, edges and muffles sound. Footsteps are swallowed before they reach the cobbles. I walked alone that evening, my overcoat damp from drizzle, the memory of the crypt heavy in my chest. The case had concluded, yet resolution felt less like relief than a long, drawn exhalation. I returned to the Randolph, sitting by the window with a single glass of whiskey, amber against the gloom. The fire across the room flickered in polite cadence, its warmth an apology for the chill outside. I thought of Eliza Hartwell, of the letters never sent, the carved ciphers, the pumpkin that had borne witness to fear and jealousy. Some confessions are spoken aloud, some exist only in gestures, in the precise arrangement of objects, in the careful placement of words. A student passed below, humming a fragment of Schubert's Song Without Words. The melody drifted upward through the mist, hesitant, unfinished, as if uncertain it could survive the journey. I sipped the whiskey and let the notes fill the quiet spaces between memory and thought. Music has a way of expressing what words cannot, and I realized that the city itself seemed to breathe in tune with it, the lamps glowing faintly, the stones reflecting the faint light like ink on parchment. Lewis had tried to rationalize the events, as he always does, reducing them to sequence and consequence. But the true narrative, I knew, was more delicate, a lattice of emotion and intellect, of fear disguised as prudence and love misunderstood. Vale's composure, the Dean's tremor, Cleeve's careless charm, each gesture had signaled more than their words, had revealed the hidden architecture of motive. and in the center of it, Hartwell's intellect, alive even in absence, had guided the path to truth. I recalled the inscriptions in the Radcliffe undercroft, faint letters carved decades before, now luminous in memory. Vitis vetita vivit in corde. The forbidden vine lives in the heart. How often had we mistaken action for intent, gestures for truth? The vine is patient. It waits until one is willing to recognize it. Outside, the river murmured against its banks, the sound of water in perpetual negotiation with stone. A foghorn from the distant canal carried its low note across the quiet streets. I thought of the pumpkin in Radcliffe Square, hollowed, a container of both message and misdirection. The wine, the letters, the carved initials, each a voice without words, each a testament to human pride and fallibility. I traced a finger along the rim of the glass. The whiskey was nearly gone. Time seemed to pause, reluctant to intrude upon reflection. Oxford had taught me that endings are rarely neat. They are always tentative, like a melody left unfinished, waiting for a listener to complete it in thought. In that silence, I allowed myself to imagine Hartwell's voice, crisp and insistent, directing the past toward revelation. I remembered her marginal notes, her impatient corrections of others' misquotes, the subtle insistence that truth, however inconvenient, cannot remain hidden indefinitely. And I understood that the case was not a story closed, but a conversation continuing, in whispers, in inscriptions, in songs without words. I drained the last of the whiskey, listening to the faint echo of the student's hum dissipate into the night. Somewhere, a bell marked the hour, and as the fog thickened around the lamps, I realized that Oxford itself, like music and memory, preserves the space for reflection, for ambiguity, for the quiet ache of understanding. The city exhaled, and I, alone in the fading light, breathed with it, carrying the weight of truth that never demands applause.